For the last 10 years, the story of Indonesia's economy has been defined by a relentless, massive physical expansion. The outgoing administration leaves behind a highly visible physical legacy, a massive, debt-driven infrastructure boom intended to physically connect the archipelago. The Ministry of Finance justified this expansive fiscal policy with a core economic rationale: borrow heavily now to build infrastructure, and the resulting multiplier effect will drive long-term economic growth. But this chart, comparing the infrastructure budget directly against debt financing from 2014 to 2024, reveals a different macroeconomic reality. While the budget for actual infrastructure increased by nearly 53%, the amount of debt financing surged by 203%. The visible concrete of the nation's new bridges and toll roads effectively masks a structurally compromised and deeply leveraged sovereign balance sheet. This imbalance is highly visible to the international financial community. Despite the continuous economic growth reported domestically, independent analysts and major global credit rating agencies are explicitly flashing warning signs. Agencies like Fitch and Moody's have recently revised Indonesia's economic outlook to negative. Why would top global economists downgrade a nation that has spent a decade relentlessly building its physical economy? To understand the downgrade, we have to look past the infrastructure and unpack the composition of the national deficit, specifically how state capital is being spent and what debt servicing is doing to the remaining budget. The incoming administration inherits the physical connectivity of the archipelago, but they also inherit a sovereign balance sheet that significantly narrows their future policy options. The evidence for this trap is documented in the raw data published by the Ministry of Finance. In sovereign finance, there is a strict difference between borrowing money to invest in new, revenue-generating assets and borrowing money merely to finance existing debt. This chart breaks down Indonesia's actual financing split, comparing debt financing against true investment financing over a 10-year timeline. Notice the ceiling. Over the entire decade, the portion of government financing allocated for actual investment never exceeded 17.5%. Mathematically, the vast majority of borrowed funds are not being directed into productive sectors that generate future revenue. The government is caught in a continuous loop, taking on new debt to pay off old debt, which pushes the national deficit ever wider. This continuous accumulation shifts an immense, compounding financial burden directly onto future generations. The balance sheet proves Indonesia's borrowing strategy is failing to build a self-sustaining economy. It acts as a temporary patch for a leaking hull. To bypass budget constraints and turn public debt into physical infrastructure, the government used a primary transmission mechanism: state-owned enterprises. The tool to fund these corporations was the State Capital Injection, or PMN, representing direct cash transfers from the national treasury. Looking at this flow of capital, we see a staggering scale of funding. Total PMN allocated to infrastructure SOEs increased by 327%. But contrast that massive input against the anemic output. When we evaluate the asset growth of these 8 companies, the mechanism stalls. Despite absorbing trillions in direct state capital, half of these major firms failed to grow their assets by even 15%. The most severe anomaly in this data is PT Waskita Karya. While receiving massive capital injections from the state, Waskita Karya actually experienced a nearly 10% decline in total assets. Capital injections are no longer generating new value. They are being diverted to shore up corporate structures that are failing to grow. This corporate failure connects directly to the political push for rapid, highly visible construction projects that simply ignored fiscal realities. Independent studies show that Indonesia's infrastructure push is recognized globally as legally complex, highly inconsistent, and ultimately damaging to investor trust. By treating state-owned enterprises as bottomless receptacles for debt, the state turned its primary growth engines into massive fiscal sinkholes. These corporate imbalances impact the national budget directly, creating friction in the public services Indonesian citizens rely on every day. This chart illustrates the crowding out effect. Mandatory debt payments consume capital, actively crushing revenue for public goods. As an example, environmental protection spending has been crushed, falling to less than 1.5%. When tax revenue cannot cover this widening gap, the government turns to the central bank for controversial solutions. This resulted in the burden-sharing scheme between the Finance Ministry and Bank Indonesia, a mechanism that essentially equates to printing money. Economists warn this scheme is a time bomb that fuels inflation, already eroding the rupiah's value by 12% against the US dollar. Uncontrolled debt financing acts as a hidden tax. It impoverishes the public by inflating currency while gutting the social services they rely on. These fiscal constraints now define the immediate landscape for the incoming administration as they take control of the national treasury. The Prabowo Gibran administration has built an agenda that relies heavily on introducing massive, expensive new social initiatives. The flagship initiative drawing the sharpest focus from analysts is the Free Nutritious Meals program, projected to cost over 1% of GDP. This program triggered Moody's explicit warning. Expanding social spending on top of a structurally weak revenue base points to dangerous policy planning. To fund these meals, drastic measures are already under consideration, such as cannibalizing budgets originally meant for infrastructure maintenance. The new administration is on a collision course, attempting to stack highly expensive, populist initiatives on top of a mathematically fracturing foundation. To avoid a fiscal crisis and regain macroeconomic stability, the new administration must adopt strict, mathematically required policy shifts. First, the government must immediately halt economically unviable megaprojects that drain capital without returning yield. Second, state-owned enterprises must face aggressive reform. Any future capital injections must be tied strictly to rigorous efficiency and sustainability metrics, ending the era of the unconditional bailout. Third, Indonesia must pivot away from debt reliance. It must broaden its domestic revenue and tax base to sustainably fund public services and avoid the middle-income trap. Restoring the structural integrity to this massive economic system will require disciplined design and rigid, inflexible financial boundaries. Debt is merely a financial tool. Without disciplined capital allocation, it ceases to build nations, and instead engineers a structural trap from which escape is incredibly painful.